You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
The whole reason, we're being told anyways, why our Confederate monuments and memorials are being torn down is because they are monuments to racism. They're monuments to white supremacy. So when I'm reading in the newspaper that the city of Detroit is renaming a school, Dr. Benjamin Carson High School, named for the Secretary of Urban Development, Benjamin Carson. Remember, he was a presidential candidate in the 2016 Republican primary, and President Trump then selected him to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Carson is a brilliant neurosurgeon, and he personally funded the construction of a high school in the neighborhood that he grew up in Detroit, near his boyhood home, in the ghetto, in the hood of Detroit. And the whole purpose of the Carson School is to take young, primarily black students who have an aptitude towards the sciences and give them a high school education that will prepare them to go to college, where they will study medical and scientific majors in college, so that they get the academic foundation they need in high school so they could go on to pursue degrees in the medical field and in different scientific fields. I mean, this is a school that is for the exceptional, and to give them the academic foundation they need to get out of the hood. I mean, this is a great thing that Dr. Carson has done. But now the Detroit School District wants to take that school that he's financed and that he's helped to build, and they want to take his name off it. And the only reason that they're really giving is because he's in the Trump administration. But here's the even funnier thing. There's another school there in the Detroit School District that is named for a white slaveholder. And at the same time they were voting to take Dr. Benjamin Carson's name off of that school, they said that we're going to keep the name of Cass the same, even acknowledging that Cass had been a slaveholder. So why is that? Well, there's the one obvious reason, and that is that Cass was a Democrat and Carson was a conservative Republican. But it goes a little deeper than that. Another thing that I want to call to your attention is that the other school that's named for a very prominent black person right now, whose name is about to be changed. There is a school that is named, a college building that is named for Justice Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court, who is the nation's highest-ranking black judge. And the student body and the school administration is clamoring now, and they want to take his name off the school, and they want to name it for, of all people, Anita Hill. And their motivation for that, of course, came during the Kavanaugh fiasco. Now that the left is running out of things named for our Confederate heroes to attack, they are rapidly attacking institutions named for prominent black Americans. Why are they turning on the very thing that they were supposed to be upholding? And the reason why is because Marxism, leftism, liberalism, the whole Democrat Party identity politics, it has never been about fighting racism. It has always been about promoting an agenda. Crying about racism, they're just trying to create a victim class. And then by defending that victim class, they gain supporters. That's their strategy. That's their modus operandi. But sooner or later, that victim class starts to wise up. Or there are always people within that victim class that were wise to begin with. People like Dr. Carson. People who never bought into the Democrat lie. People like Justice Thomas. People who never bought into the Democrat Marxist lies. And so in the name of free speech, the liberals will silence the voice of a Clarence Thomas, or they will silence the voice of a Dr. Carson. Just like the liberals will ultimately end up silencing the voices of the gay, who prove to be fiscally conservative, or who prove to support common sense initiatives on the right of the political spectrum in other areas of life, just as they will silence the voice of any woman who dares to question their agenda and their ideology. And so it's never been about free speech. It's always been about the agenda. And what they're doing is they're taking shots at the past. And by taking shots at the past, they're attacking our future. Because, as I said, political correctness doesn't fight racism. And it doesn't fight discrimination. It actually implements it. And it uses the same political power that it tears down monuments with, that it renames institutions with, in the name of diversity, by the way, to suppress anything that is diverse from itself. And so blacks, women's, gays, any others whom it claims to be protecting from discrimination, it will ultimately discriminate against and ultimately silence when it deviates from the prescribed political correctness. And so the very existence of a Judge Thomas or a Dr. Carson threatens And by erasing the name of Justice Thomas from the school, they erase for a generation of not yet even practicing black lawyers the history of black conservatism and the values of black conservatives. And by erasing the name of Dr. Carson from that high school, then what they're doing is they're telling an entire generation of young black high school students that they shouldn't rise up, but that rather they should just be the victims of a culture war that has been inflicted upon our society by their leftist teachers for the last few generations. Because, as I said a moment ago, the leftists and the Marxists are really at war with the past. And it's funny because the past is fixed. They can't change it. Nothing they can do will change it. And they know that. But by taking shots at the past, they're really fighting for their vision of the future. And that's why I agree with whoever said that a nation and a people without a past will have no future. And that's basically the gist of the editorial that I wrote that was featured at the beginning of the January-February 2019 issue of TBR, the Barnes Review Magazine. Our regular listeners know that at the first of every other month here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, our guest is always Paul Angel, and Paul is the executive editor of TBR Magazine, the TBR and TBR Radio Presents. And so, keeping with our custom, I'm going to be interviewing Paul today, and we're going to be talking about the January-February issue of the Barnes Review. And it's a great issue. If I had to give it a theme, I would say that the subject is ancient civilization. And the cover had a diorama, I guess is the more correct term. And it's the Hungarians, the debate about their origin, and the cover is just a spectacle with this diorama of these Hungarian warriors of ancient time. Much of the magazine had to do with ancient civilization, and of course then there were just a couple of articles there at the end that dealt outside of that. One of them also, in addition to my editorial, being an article that I wrote that immigration is the new slavery. And what we're seeing now is, in addition to the left turning on men like Dr. Carson and Justice Thomas, in other words, going after the monuments to black people who they disagree with, we're also seeing monuments taken down now that were monuments to men who are claimed to be racist, claimed to be bigots, but these men were not slaveholders. In one case, the man wasn't even a Confederate. In the other case, the man was a Confederate, but he was a Confederate who had also been an abolitionist. And yes, there were abolitionists in the South during the war. There were. He was a very prominent Southern abolitionist, but when his home and his family and his state were invaded by a foreign army, which is exactly what happened, the United States of America invaded the Confederate States of America, thus threatening the home and the livelihood and the security and the sanctity and so forth of the Southern people and the Southern states, and their homes and hearths and so forth came under attack. And so he joined the Confederate Army, but he was an abolitionist, and there probably wasn't a racist bone in his body. And if you're looking for evidence that there might have been, you can look and look and look, and you're not going to find it. But supposedly he was against immigration. There's no proof of that, but supposedly he was. The other statue in question was a statue to a gentleman who had started the newspaper there in Louisville, Kentucky. And I could establish very easily that he was against immigration because he wrote several newspaper editorials back in the 1870s and the 1880s opposing the immigration of the Chinese into the country. So you could make the case that he was against immigration. But what happened is immigration's becoming the new slavery, and that's the title of the article. And so now we're taking down monuments to men, not because they were slaveholders, not because they were Confederates, but because they were against immigration. And let me tell you what the real danger of that is. The real danger of that is that slavery is a behavior. And admittedly, it is a behavior that is hard to justify. It's hard to defend. But being against immigration policy, on the other hand, is politics. And that's very different from behavior. So now we're going against the statues of men because we disagreed with their politics. And that is an even more slippery slope than the one that the left was already engaged upon by taking down the monuments to people because they didn't agree with their behavior, be it behavior that they joined the Confederate Army, behavior that they were a slaveholder, etc., etc. Where does that end? Because the politics of both the left and the right are constantly changing. What is politically correct today on either side might not be politically correct tomorrow. So in just a few short years, are we going to have to start taking down the statues of people who were pro-life? Or maybe the people who were pro-abortion? Are we going to have to start taking down the monuments to people because of the economic policies that they advocated? Are we going to have to start taking down the statues of people, for any of a number of other political issues? It's just crazy. They're wanting to take down the statues of Christopher Columbus. The same thing. They're saying Columbus was anti-immigrant. I don't see how they get that. You'd think Columbus would be the poster child for immigration. But again, it's politics. And so are we going to have to assess the politics of the subject of every monument in our country? I mean, the truth is, with each and every one of these monuments, the left, if they look not too hard, they're going to find something that they're going to disagree with. I mean, the monuments to JFK, should we tear them down? Or Abraham Lincoln? I mean, after all, they were white men. JFK, there's all kinds of politics of JFK that the left is against now. Certainly the left would take opposition to a lot of the politics of Abraham Lincoln, not to mention the racism. I mean, that guy said enough racist stuff to fill a volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Basically, we're headed for Orwell's 1984 vision of a dark future where every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book has been rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and every building has been renamed, every day has been altered, and the process just continues day by day, minute by minute. History is being stopped, and nothing will exist except the endless present in which the party is always right. Again, it goes back to my editorial at the beginning of the magazine. The past is the future. Without my going on and on about the things that I wrote in this Barnes Review issue, I want to go ahead and I want to go to our interview with Paul Angel. Setting up that call with Paul, let's go ahead and play the Barnes Review commercial. It takes about 60 seconds, and we'll be right back, and we'll have Paul Angel on the line. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. I gotta find it again. If I had to give this issue a theme, and I realize it's not a themed issue, but if I were to give this issue a theme, it would have been something, relative to the ancient world, because that's seems right. to be that's where a lot of the articles are drawing from.
That's right.
So, of all of the different articles on the ancient world, why did you decide to lead and do the cover with the Hungarian story?
Because there's not that many great pictures for the lead story, nor the lost inventions. The lost inventions were kind of boring looking. But the Hungarians, that's that great picture of that famous cyclorama that the guy took years to do. That was 40 feet tall by, 600 feet wide or something. I got the dimensions in there. It's an awesome picture. And that's really why, because it provided the best piece of artwork.
And I've noticed, too, under the new books, there's a book on the Norse discovery of America.
Correct. That's an old compilation of the Icelandic sagas translated from the original Icelandic.
That's something that I'm surprised we didn't see a little bit more detail on in the magazine. But again, it goes with the ancient world theme.
Well, it's also something that we've discussed a lot. We had an issue called "Who Got to America First" years ago, and we had repeated several of one of the Icelandic sagas in particular. And so and we had a Viking on the cover, so was just something unique and interesting. But if I were to start this thing out, I would just talk about Oak Island, because that's I'm familiar with. So we can just have a discussion about that and see how long that goes.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting about the Oak Island article was the Freemasonry angle that Mark Rowland put on it.
So, Oak Island is a mystery that a lot of people have been interested in for many, many years. They've been going on about Oak Island, I think, researching and looking for treasure for 220 years. The story, of course, more people are interested now because there's a History Channel program on it. And generally, I don't push anything that's on the History Channel because they have more ancient aliens and Bigfoot stuff than they do real history. But this is a fascinating thing because these two guys, the Lagina brothers, Marty and somebody else, I can't remember the other guy's name was, Marty and Rick Lagina, evidently pulled a lot of money and got some investors. And they have gone at Oak Island, which is this small island off of Nova Scotia. They have been going at it with massive excavation efforts. Of course, they have to get now permits for every single thing, but the things that they are doing on Oak Island have never been done before. People have been working on Oak Island on various digs and sizes and funding and all since it was found. And it was found way back. Young men who just started digging. They saw a depression there in the ground on Oak Island. There was a hook over this hole, and it looked kind of suspicious, so they started digging. And all of a sudden, like every 10 feet, they came across a layer of oak timbers. So many people have said it's nothing but a fraud, But a lot of people with a lot of money have gone in there. These guys dug down every 10 feet they found, and they were doing it by hand. It may have been in the late 1770s. I wish I knew off the top of my head, but I should look at the article more carefully. but then at the depth of, 30 or 40 feet, they find this strange stone with an inscription, and they were unable to go much further. It had a strange code they couldn't really decipher. That stone was on display in a shop window for many years in the town near Oak Island. Oak Island is connected to the mainland by a little causeway that's gotten bigger and bigger as more traffic has gone over there. They know they found something, but they had to stop. They didn't have the excavating material. They were doing this by hand. And later on, I think I don't think it was these guys, but later on, some other diggers came in, and when they got down to the level below the mystery stone, floodwater started. Later on, a couple more researchers got out there, and floodwater would come tumbling in here to this tunnel, and they figured it was some type of a booby trap system. And they surmised that it might be, and it's tasting it was seawater, but the origin of the water they couldn't figure out, and they explored, and they found a place called Smith's Cove where it looked like some type of a box drain system had been put in place, and they found massive amounts of coconut fiber. Well, the coconut fiber acted as a filter for the seawater and muck to keep these booby-trap tunnels open. At least that's the theory. Well, one thing you do know, Ed, is that there ain't no coconuts growing on Nova Scotia, so coconut palms. So they figured this had to have been brought in by some people that were well before the modern era. I think they did carbon dating on the coconut fiber. It may have been from the 1700s. Well, there were so many theories here. Was it pirates? Was there a treasure? Was it Templars? Was it Masons? They didn't know. So these guys, and over the years, they found some crazy stuff. Spanish coins from the 1600s, I think, and British coins and French stuff. They don't know what it was. The prevailing theories were wild and varying. Marie Antoinette's jewelry, the famous jewels of Marie Antoinette brought by a handmaiden here, may have been buried there, may have been something from the Holy Land. We all know that the Templars in the 1300s were pretty much sent scurrying with the persecution of the French and the Catholic Church, I believe, because they had amassed a great amount of money during their time in the Holy Land. While they were there, of course, they were over the alleged site of the Temple Mount, right? Solomon's Temple, and there was always rumors that stuff had been buried there. The Templar fleet, of course, disappeared and started sailing west from, I believe it was France. And they may have taken their massive treasure there, even though they were hunting down these Templars at the time. And Jacques de Molay, of course, was immolated, and others as well, burned at the stake and tortured and everything else. But they never did get the humongous.
So weren't there other weird stuff there too, like the carving of a severed head and stone carved human organs? And
absolutely. I mean, look, it's a long. There's evidence for so much stuff, but yeah, they found all kinds of stuff. I don't want to ruin the story, but on this island there are these crosses, Templar crosses carved in stone. The severed head, of course, is associated with the John the Baptist part of the Templar cult, we'll say. And but But until and believe me, there was guys. So there's been guys really excavating, but the ways they were doing it back in the day was not very archaeologically speaking. They were just digging these huge trenches and huge pits, and they were collapsing. Multiple people died during these searches from multiple search excavation organizations. A couple guys that were digging a pretty good trench down there, or a big pit to get down, were overcome with noxious methane gas, I think it was. And of course, then the Blankenships were doing this. This is the one man, I think he's 95, and his son might be 75 or 65, something like that. And they're still involved in this. But they've got all kinds of theories. And every time they find something, it's really weird. I mean, they found bone at the bottom of a couple hundred feet down in one of these pits, and they're trying to find what's called the money pit. Well, nobody knows where the money pit really is. They're trying to locate it now. But like they found bones dated from one Middle Eastern bone and one European bone, and I think it was from like the 1600s or something. They found coins from the 1600s. Well, nothing's supposed to have been there. Nobody's really supposed to have been there. And of course, oaks themselves aren't supposed to be native to this, and there's a huge oak grove there of course, the oak was sacred to some of these religious groups, and that from the Celts, but also others. And they were like, what the heck, where'd the oak trees come from? And so there's just so many mysteries going on there. But this group, the Lagina group, of course, has found evidence of a British encampment. And they found buttons and pieces of metal and hinges and this and that on one portion of the island. They found what looks like a crossbow bolt on what they call Smith's Cove, where these box drains, crazy box drains are, that they alleged drain into Booby Trap, the money pit. And it with the iron crossbow bolt they thought may have been Roman. Now, I don't know. This doesn't mean the Romans were there. It means somebody was carrying around this high-quality iron. This was extremely high-quality iron. They have found a cross, what looked like it was made out of a lead, which is not from a North American source. It was definitely a European source. And it was very high-quality lead, and it was in the shape of a cross, but not just any cross. It looked a lot. The head was cocked over a little bit. It was a crucifix without Christ on there. And but it looked so much like the drawings and the carvings, I should say, that the Templars had made into the walls of the prison they were kept in. And so, once again, it's just confusing what they find. Spanish pieces of eight. A lady whose father had dug on the island brought them a very high-quality piece of gold cross that looked like it had been Peruvian or Incan. The jewel had been removed. And so what the heck is all this stuff doing there? So at this point in time, they're still not sure, because you can't explain the crossbow bolt. And by the way, the lead looked like it may have been, the way they were testing it, it could have been from the 1300s. Well, this would kind of correspond with the Templar. But that, again, doesn't mean that a Templar was there. It means that somebody had a cross around their neck and it dropped off of them. And so it's like finding Roman sculptures or Greek sculptures in the bays of Brazil. People will say, oh, this proves that the Greeks and the Romans had to have been here. No, the Greeks and the Romans were using, and later on, the later people like the Portuguese and others were using old Roman sculptures that they had broken up as ballast. So you had to be very careful about the conclusions you come to about such a thing. But at this point in time, a man who was kind of involved in going to visit these guys on the island, the Guina brothers, wrote a book, and he believes the Freemasons were involved. The Freemason symbology is related in many respects, right, to the Templar mythology. Some people even believe the Masons are descendants of the Templar way, we'll say. Then you're starting to say, okay, so what's the biggest amount of evidence we have here? Who could have pulled this off? Because this would have been a pretty sophisticated architectural operation here, to dig this massive pit, to place different levels on it, to put marker stones, to have a booby trap system, to have other carved stones. There's even massive stone crosses that are formed by large boulders that take up acres and acres. You couldn't even see these crosses, these stone crosses made out of multiple stones, unless you were looking at it from above ground. Of course, the Templars and the Masons and the British in the 1750s were all pretty sophisticated. They don't know what these stones mark. Recently, I'll get back to the other stuff. The most recent theory was from a guy who was like a NASA scientist with 3 different degrees, has started to apply some archaeoastronomy to it, which should always be done first, in my opinion. But they hadn't really done it. And when he overlaid, I think, a star map of Taurus, it hit on many of the different stars placed down on the island it would have corresponded with multiple rock formations, huge boulders with crosses on them, famous little conglomerations of stones that, by the way, people have just, the other excavators were, like I said, were not very archaeologically astute, have covered over, buried, moved, and so it's difficult to find out. But anyway, the prevailing theory is that British Navy and Army, whatever, after attacking and overwhelming the Moro Castle in Havana, where the Spanish kept all their loot, the Aztec gold and the Incan gold, valued probably in today in the billions of dollars. I'm not sure. And probably and by the way, the naval leaders at the time were all interconnected, not just by blood, but by masonry. And so these guys at the time in England in the 1700s, masonry was under heavy attack. It was almost going to be outlawed, right? The secret societies were not very well received. They thought there was accusations against them. They were getting involved in all kinds of political movements and amassing money and influencing politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So they were on the verge of being banned there, just as they were banned 400 years earlier in France and other countries in Europe, and that they probably needed the money to resuscitate the Freemasonic movement. And so you look at the officers that were involved, and they're all Masons. You look at many of the researchers that are involved, and the excavators over the years, they were all Masons. Franklin Roosevelt was involved, and he's a Mason. And they were always writing, these guys were writing letters to Roosevelt when he was, well before he was president, because he was working there when he was a young man, I think before he had polio. So, like, there's a Masonic connection somehow. Anyway, this guy's written a very good book about it, and we're offering that book for sale, and in conjunction with the issue. But that's their idea now, is that the Masons certainly had the wherewithal, they had the knowledge, they had the architectural ability, they had the upper level connections, they had the knowledge. Masons were in charge of the attack on the Moro Castle. Masons may have sent, I think they sent $150 million over to the King of England. But many people estimated the treasure to be much, much larger. So where'd the rest of it go? The theory is they took it and buried it on Oak Island. We will see whether or not they find a treasure on Oak Island or not. They have found a lot of amazing things, which is the great thing about history in general and revisionism, is that when you finally put your nose to the grindstone and start digging and looking and figuring, you find some things that always surprise you. Just like they found Göbekli Tepe years ago, right, from which shocked the world and sent the whole archaeological community into a tizzy, because all these tenured professors had been wrong about the origins of the civilization in general, and that there were people before the Sumerians. So who knows what they're going to find? I just know it's a very interesting story. I read the Lagina brothers got going because they read many years ago a story in National Geographic, and I remember reading the same National Geographic in my great aunt's living room, and what a fascinating its story was. So personally, it's the lead story here, although the cover does have a beautiful picture of the Hungarians, which we'll get to in a moment. But I encourage people to take a look at this book that we're selling. It's called With the Curse of Oak Island, which is the name of the television show as well. And that can be gotten through the Barnes Review bookstore at www.barnesreview.org. And take a look at that. But there'll be more coming out about this as they continue further, because every television show with the amount of, they've actually gone to the point, Ed, of making a metal cofferdam, which I think is about 20 feet, 30 feet tall, where they've driven these massive steel pylons into the ground 20 feet deep so they can block the water off from where these box drains are, where they found this coconut fiber. And so people are, anxiously waiting to see what they find there and whether or not they're ever able to solve this massive mystery that has intrigued people. I can't believe that millionaires are going up there, a lot of them Masons again, and wasting so much money unless somebody knows a little bit more about us, about what might be there. And so the Masonic connection is kind of a new thing, but a very fascinating thing. At any rate, that was our lead story, were the Freemasons responsible for any Oak Island treasure that was to be found there.
Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Another one by an author named Mark Rowland. It's just some of the lost inventions of the ancients. We think we're so sophisticated now with our alarm clocks and seismometers and refrigeration and city planning and sewage and toiletry and running water and aqueduct systems. We know
that's because we've never been to Europe. I noticed that when I first got to Europe, the first time I went there, I landed at the airport in Barcelona, and the taxi driver is taking me, to the hotel. And the road that I'm driving on, I asked him, I said, how old is this road? He said, probably about 1,800 years old. And I'm like, and then there's like this ditch over there. He's like, well, I'm like, what's that over there? He's like, that's the aquifer. I said, so is that taking your water in or out or what? He goes, that's how our water gets into the city. And he told me, he said probably 3/4 of the plumbing for our city central water system was built before Jesus by the Romans.
But yeah, it's amazing, and even older than that, because like in North America, the colonials, and this was not super ancient, but it's the point. The point is that many of our roads were already made for us, not by the Indians, but by the buffalo and other large animals making their way to salt licks. Okay, you're talking about a massive herd of buffalo going to a salt lick. You're talking about tens of thousands of animals year after year after year after year. So we think and look at some of these roads and we're like, wow, these pilgrims or whoever they were, early colonists really must have put a lot of work into it. Not really. Some of the stuff was there. I'd even imagine that some of the roads in Europe that were built by the Romans were laid upon old salt roads and salt, animal trails to salt licks. That being said, I say that only because I just read a book called Salt, which is a very popular book now, and it just talks about all the number of cities and how important salt was and how ancient salt was. But anyway, yeah, I mean, they were way ahead of us. We're talking about the first toilet and the first city planning that had really had sanitation with drainage and getting rid of the sewage, and running water was in, kenosis way back when, in Crete, way before anything else. And of course, we had central heating in the Roman houses, where they would have an area under the homes that was hollow, and they would light fires and force the hot air under. So these Romans, you think, oh my gosh, tile, when you go in your bathroom in the morning, it's freezing cold outside. At least up here where I am and anywhere north of me, your feet are very cold. But the Romans were walking on tile, of course, which they had a lot of, but they didn't. They had like heated floors and everything else. Of the Chinese inventions from ancient history. And one of them was, and also the Eskimos, right, have invented a few things that would surprise people.
The picture of the Eskimos with sunglasses on.
Yeah, they got that's for snow blindness. They just take pieces of bone, carve a very modern looking piece of goggle. And while the Europeans might be getting blinded after a few days in the snow, the Eskimo with their little bone carved goggles and small slits would prevent the snow blindness. This one Chinese man in the 1st century AD invented a seismometer. His name was Zheng Hang. And it was an amazing thing. Like, there was a water and a big urn, humongous metal urn with dragons in the side, and there was frogs waiting on the side made of metal on the base. And if the water came from the earthquake came from a certain direction of a certain magnitude, it would drop a ball into the frog's mouth. I mean, amazing stuff. Plato's alarm clock we talk about way back when. He got tired of his students coming to class late, so he worked out a way of a water clock that would wake them up. Of course, it was interesting enough that he was able to figure out how to drip the water down into increments and control it so that it would time it so a certain amount of water would fill up, but then the water would be forced into a smaller area, almost like, even though it wasn't heated, like a tea kettle. And when the water was collected and then filled up, it would escape from this vessel and make a hissing sound, or a tea kettle sound, and wake these students up that used to irritate them so badly. Of course, the Iranians had a way of keeping things cold in their desert areas, and they were called yakchals. I'll say, I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's Yakhchal, and this was like an evaporative cooler system, and you was capable of preserving ice for a while. Now, it wouldn't freeze and cold in there, but they could. Even like when you go to Monticello or Mount Vernon, right, they always had ice houses for the colonials, and they would fill it up with water, I suppose, and then it would freeze in the wintertime. And that would last quite a bit of time when you're talking about blocks of ice being 6-7 feet thick, underground especially. But the sophistication of this particular construction is interesting. They had rifled the interior of the dome. This is a large dome structure, and the air would then spiral around and come down, and they made sure there were openings coming from the north so that they were catching the cooler air. And so we moderns think we're so sophisticated, and these ancient people had many different, all kinds of inventions, including even a early steam engine from the Roman era, Roman Egypt. So there's always something, movable type, all kinds of stuff. We're not quite as smart as we think we are, but we can thank our ancestors for coming up with some pretty amazing things and leading the way. John Tiffany did an article on the mysterious origins of the Hungarians. It's a pretty sophisticated article as far as tracing the genetics of it. And I'm not really up on it like John was. He would be a much better person to interview. But in short, as most people know, the Hungarians speak a language that is unlike most of the other Indo-European languages. I don't think it is an Indo-European language, not sure. But it's Finno-Ugric. So there's some Scandinavian groups, specifically the Finns, who speak this language. And then you have the Mansi and others over in Lapland-like type people in northern Russia, a large area, I should say. It's not a large number. And then right in the middle of Europe, the Hungarians. And people have been arguing about where they came from, why they're speaking this language. And so John took the words in common with ancient cultures from northern India, I believe. I've got this story right. Theory was that, the Hungarians in general were very adaptive. In other words, they could adapt to new people coming in, or they could get them to adapt to theirs. So they were integrated well. Belief was that they came in contact with people who spoke a Finno-Ugric language. The question is, where did they come from? oh, they must have obviously been, the Magyars must have come from these Finno-Ugric areas in Russia. Well, now they're starting to wonder whether or not exactly how this happened and where the migration came from to bring this language here, and whether or not there was a large population there, or whether they had come in contact, or whether they were from this group. You have to read the articles. You see that I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on much of anything, but I know certain things. But this is one that's beyond me. You got to read the story. But the conclusion, come across by a guy named Denny Sinor, very well-respected scholar of Hungarian history. To understand the mix of genetics and of languages is a fascinating thing. And also myths, of course. It's almost easier to trace people's origins through their myths and what myths they have in common. But listen, they've been arguing about the Hungarian history for many centuries. And of course, the Hungarians, according to the Gesta Honorum et Hungareum, or however you pronounce that, as a source of early Hungarian history written like 1282. They believe that there were two hunters out there who were after a mystical white stag. The stag vanished, but that's okay because these two guys, Hunor and Magor sounds like Hunor Hungarian, Magor sounds like Magyar, kidnapped and married two Sarmatian princesses. Of course, the Sarmatians are related to Attila the Hun in Hungary. So there's been so much debate over the years in the Hungarian myths and the Hungarian beliefs about their own origins. I think nowadays we have such a more sophisticated way of tracking them through their genes, through their myths, through the language. Most of this is a language thing. There's so many relationships between some of these northern Indian languages in Finno-Ugric. I think that was the point of it. People have to read that particular story. And, of course, right on the heels of that story is another story by a guy named Patrick Chenard, who years ago was a writer of pretty interesting books, man. I mean, he had written one of The Forgotten Worlds, which covered the hobbits, the hobbits of I guess it's Indonesian archipelago in that particular region, may have been Malaysian, whatever. And anyway, his story is on the ancient whites of Mongolia. This guy's always searching for where our roots came from. This kind of ties in not only with the Hungarian story, but the Ashkenazi story and everything else. You know, there's some amazing mounds, really large mounds. They call them kurgans, right? With like large megalithic circles out there in the middle of Mongolia that people have been trying to figure out who actually created them. Now, we know that in that same kind of an area was the Tarim Basin, where they found these, the mummies, the white mummies of the Taklamakan Desert, which everybody thought were going to be all pure Chinese. Well, it was a great trade route. But you found some amazing Caucasian skeletons because they were super well preserved, and it was like very salty there and desert-like. And so the two acting together, plus the lack of rain, really desiccated these bodies and preserved not only their bodies and bones, but their textiles as well. So there is definite proof that whites were in Western China. We all know as well today that many of the sophisticated terminology the Chinese adapted for charioteering and ironwork or whatever it may be were Indo-European languages. So we knew that they were out there. But anyway, they found this massive thing in Dangoin Shire, is what I say, Dangoin Shire. And it was like massive pillars. Now I mentioned earlier the kurgan.
Kind of like an ancient Stonehenge, but in China as opposed to in Europe.
Yeah, and like the kurgan, the Salbik kurgan, kind of reminds you of Avebury a little bit more in that it's shorter stones. But this one they found in Dangoin Shire, if you look at the pictures of it, and if anybody wants to look at it, I'll spell it. It's Dongoin, second word Shiree, Shiree. I mean, these pillars were, 25 feet tall, engraved, and it's circular. It may have been a grave site. It probably had some type of ditch and mound construction around it, as did Stonehenge and many other of our European constructions. Once again, an expert talking about something here, and that knows much more about it than I do. But we're talking about a little bit of DNA testing in Siberia to Southeast Asia. We're talking about 3500 BC is happening. But, this all kind of fits in with this whole idea that some megalithic culture was running around building all kinds of stuff. Everything else, as we know, we've got a book we just added from Arthur Kemp about the ancient Egyptians and the evidence that that culture was very much more white than you think. And the later sub-Saharan migrations of darker skinned people didn't happen till way after the pyramids were built and everything else. So, it sounds like we're racist, but honestly, all we're looking for is the truth here. And the evidence points to our people being a lot of places doing a lot of pretty sophisticated stuff well before a lot of others. We still do it. Let's face it. Today, we're leading the United States, for instance, I don't know about Europe, is on the forefront of developing new drugs and drug therapies and everything else. And as usual, although we charge our own people a lot of money for this stuff, the finds that we have found, the discoveries we've made that have life better for people, electricity, railways, running water, aqueducts, the roads, we've given to the world for free. So when they're trying to make you feel really bad these days as they rip down your favorite Confederate general from the square in your hometown, don't let them take away the pride that we should be feeling on our ancient people. And of course, that pretty much wrapped up our discussion and our coverage of ancient cultures.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org.
There we have some very interesting stuff. One of the other interesting articles we had by a guy named John Weir, who was trained, I think, at law school, but has become quite an expert on the World War II period, and specifically the Holocaust. But he's interested in just about everything. I mean, we're an unassuming, very intelligent guy, very good writer, sources everything, reads dozens of books for each article. And he wrote an article, and I think did you read this one on Laurel Canyon?
I started it. I didn't finish it. I found it interesting how he tied several of the famous hippie, musicians and so forth, and anti-war protesters actually to the military-industrial complex. They were, I guess, the paid loyal opposition.
Well, see, it wasn't just a couple. I mean, it was like every single star that was living in the Laurel Canyon area, and Laurel Canyon's in California, and a lot of them moved there. But you're talking about Stephen Stills, John Phillips, Cass Elliot from the Mamas and the Papas. Jim Morrison's dad was like an admiral in intelligence. You had David Crosby, Jackson Brown, Mike Nesmith of the Monkees, Frank Zappa, that weirdo. But he was very popular in like the 70s. And at any rate, all these stars, and it could be explained two ways. One is what John thinks, is since all of them were practically all their parents in some way were involved in the military-industrial complex, if not in the intelligence apparatus. So they were either there, right, and they were like a controlled opposition. They knew. They all moved to one location. And what are they all doing in the same spot? Well, that was like the cool place to be. But like also at the time, dozens of them showed up dead. A lot of them were overdoses. Remember Art Linkletter's daughter went like nuts at the time, became like a heroin addict. Lenny Bruce, Sal Mineo, Ramon Navarro, all these guys were found dead in their homes in Laurel Canyon, plus more, and not just always drug overdoses. So I don't know if they knew too much, or they were controlled opposition, they were part of it. Who knows what the story was? He just goes through the facts of it and kind of lets you figure out come to your own conclusion. But remember, there was also these massive music festivals at the time, right? And they'd show up, right? There was Woodstock, but out west there was that big concert, the Altamont Speedway. Everybody thinks these hippies were like all peace and love, right? But I mean, you go to these massive things, there was rape, beating, drug overdoses, property destruction, grand theft, autos being stolen. And so who do you bring in for your security except the Hells Angels? And the Hells Angels hated hippies. And it was evidently the Rolling Stones who wanted to control everything at the time. And so they bring in the Hells Angels, and if anybody gave them a hard time, the Hells Angels were beating these people up with sawed-off pool cues and everything else. I'm thinking of the other get-together, the big concert of the times. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But anyway, in there, you look at this, and they were extremely violent. They were all drugged up. And then, of course, you have to ask, at the same time, the hippie movement was kind of gaining traction with the anti-war protests. Were some of the actions taken by some of these guys, possibly in the military-industrial complex, designed to make it look like you couldn't trust a hippie? They're nothing but crazy, violent, drug overdosed weirdos. And so there's multiple things. You know how it is with the deep state. They're clever, and they co-opt everything they can, and so do political parties. But the interesting, the wrap up on that story is he comes up with so many connections to the military-industrial complex, so many odd occurrences at the time. It could very well be that Deep State was trying to undermine the anti-war movement. It could be that they were gathering information like they do now and controlling groups from behind the scenes in trying to find out who was joining. I always found it interesting that some of the largest, right, and most active KKK chapters back in the day were funded by the U.S. government, by the FBI. And we know this goes on all the time. It's why in the organizations I've worked for, the American Free Press, Barnes Review, the Spotlight, Liberty Lobby, that there was always oddball people trying to get into those organizations. And once in a while they get hired if they seemed like innocuous. But in the end, they were many times sent in by the government to try to infiltrate, get information, gather names, find IRS violations, blah, blah, blah. Usually they all tip their own hands because they themselves were troubled or criminals, because this is what the FBI does, right? They don't just bring a normal person over to infiltrate an organization. They usually say, we got something on you here. We know you were a child molester, so we're going to come after you with this child molestation charges unless you go in here to this organization and give us what we want, child molestation, embezzling, IRS violations, whatever they can find. It's very rare when a person says, sure, I'll go infiltrate an organization for you, and they're like a normal person. But anyway, same thing here. Fascinating story about the possibility that the entire hippie movement was just a false front, controlled by the military-industrial complex and the deep state for whatever reason we don't particularly know.
It kind of proved a theory that I have been working on for years, and that is simply that the government always hides the truth in plain sight.
Yes.
And so when the truth would eventually come out on Vietnam, and it did, the answer was simple. Well, we never denied that. It was always out there. Even the hippies were out there marching in the streets proclaiming it for all the world to hear. You just wouldn't listen.
Right.
But by choosing a vehicle like the hippies, a bunch of long-haired, drug-addicted freaks that the typical American wouldn't listen to, they discredited the truth by who they chose to allow to reveal it. I think the same thing is true even probably with 9/11. I think as the truth of things come out, I think that the major TV networks and the government and everybody else are going to pull the same line. They're going to say, no, we didn't deny that. In fact, Charlie Sheen was on late night talk shows talking about that back in 2002. But
right.
Who's going to take Charlie Sheen seriously?
You know, you hear so many crazy theories about everything. This is why magazines like the Barnes Review are important, because we try to give you the facts and let you make up your own mind. We're going to tell you what we think, but here are the facts as we see them. And they're completely different in many cases, as you pointed out. Things are in plain sight, but completely different from what the mainstream media is generally telling you. 911 being one case in point. Yeah, Charlie Sheen has been out there talking about it and what happened to him afterwards, right?
Yeah.
And then so they will, although they'll give you the information, they will try to discredit beyond belief anybody who has any different opinion. We can go into that another show. But like, I mean, at the end of the magazine, to wrap it up, because I got to run. But we have Robert Forreston, who just died recently. Here's a guy who was vilified for his entire career for doing factual research, beaten up in the streets by people and nearly killed on multiple occasions, but the guy stuck to his guns, and he kept coming up with as he personally said, by the way, he was a great guy. Here's his quote that got him in so much trouble. The putative method of genocide, as it was described by witnesses, was scientifically impossible. That's all he said. And he said, prove that you could have killed all these people with the methods you're claiming. And they never did it. So what do? You smear him. You cut off his finances. You make false fake news about him. You harass him. You have him beaten up. Who knows, sometimes they'll even poison you or assassinate you, anything to get you. Or many times if you are a person of, let's say, and this was not the case with Forreston and any revisionists I know, but anybody that they have any little, that they can set up for some little quirk of personality they have, they will set you up and go after you, and they will ruin you in any way they can to get you to shut up. You know, I'm not a big believer in the revelation of the method. I think that's usually a cop-out in the end. But it certainly exists, putting it right in front of your face, right? It's happened so many times, and the bigger the lie, the more easily it's swallowed. So why not put it out there? Especially when then you have teams of people in the military-industrial complex and the intelligence community ready to attack you and ruin you if you do tell the truth. Strange, the world we live in, getting stranger every day. Here's another guy, Horst Mahler. I'll wrap that up. Horst Mahler was a political activist back in the day. He was a leftist, became a conservative, and was very concerned about what was happening in Germany with the diminution of free speech. I would say the eradication of free speech, unless you want a free speech about something politically correct. But this guy, they put him in jail. I mean, the guy's like in his 80s now. He's been diabetic. They got him for refusing. His biggest thing was that the German government isn't legit because it was never a peace treaty signed after World War II, and that's an occupation government, has been for many years. He was also very vocal about allowing people to speak about the incorrect topics, but in Germany you cannot do that. I just saw something the other day that they're putting the old third box on the form that you can check to say you're not male, you're not female, you're other. Other is what? I don't know. But at any rate, Germany has gone like nutty. Anyway, the poor guy's wants to get out of jail. He's near death. He's lost a leg in prison from diabetes, but they're so vindictive. And they want him, they don't want any sympathy for this guy. The public might actually listen to this guy, Horst Mahler. He's a hero. They won't let him out of prison. He's going to die in prison. And his greatest crime was stating his opinions. He was never really trying to rile anybody up. That he did in his younger days when he was a leftist. But they're not going to let him get out there and give you any type of truth, especially in Germany. It can't be done. It's crazy over there.
And we are literally running out of time here on this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So if you want to find out the rest of what's the great content in this February 2019 issue of the Barnes Review Magazine, you're just going to have to go to the TBR website, www.barnesreview.org. and read the magazine. If you're a subscriber, you can download it. If you're not, subscribe today. You won't regret it, I promise. Also, as I go, I want to remind you we have all of our broadcasts of the Dixie Heritage Hour from 2018, and I want to mail that CD to you with all those MP3 files so you can re-listen. All you have to do is go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, and you can order the CD right there. And tell you that we are looking forward to a great new 2019 with a renewed effort to just take this radio show and step it up a notch. If you'll go to our Barnes Review website, barnesreview.org. You can click on the radio tab, and you can find the back episodes of the show there as well. So until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.